Mariam Khan is a quiet, practical woman from the river town of Berhanpur, known for sewing, tending a small tea stall, and repairing anything with a hinge or a loose screw. When a brand new hydroelectric weir designed by 10 glossy engineers begins to fail, choking the town's water, threatening crops, and endangering lives, she watches, listens, and remembers. Where the engineers rely on models, meetings, and certificates, Mariam leans on touch, the language of flowing water, and stories her grandfather taught her. Using a rag, a length of rope, and an idea born from childhood riverside days, she devises a simple, stubborn fix that no one expected. Her solution saves Berhanpur, but what happens next? Corporate claims, media storms, and the town's fiercest reckonings with pride, greed, and what counts as expertise transforms Mariam and everyone around her. The story is a cinematic, emotionally rich exploration of ordinary genius, the grind between ambition and humility, and how a single, brave act can unmask both the best and worst in people. They called Berhanpur a ribbon town because the river folded like cloth through its center, slick and blue against the ochre of the banks. In summer, the sound of water was the town's grammar. Always there, speaking around the market stalls and up through the narrow lanes where children chased one another with stolen mangoes. Mariam knew that grammar the way other women knew stitches. She could tell, by the smell and the sound, and the way a current tugged a reed, whether the river had taken a storm upstream or whether the stones beneath were beginning to change. Mariam's life never demanded names in glossy fonts. She mended torn shirts until needles left caluses in the web of her fingers. She brewed tea in a battered kettle at the edge of the bridge and sold it to fishermen for 2 rupees a cup. People liked the way she listened when their problems softened into the steam. She had no diploma on the wall, only a faded photograph of a man with silver hair and watery eyes. The grandfather who had taught her how to read the river and how to measure humidity by the sigh of barn swallows. No engineer's book can teach you the river, he used to say, wrapping his elbow around her small shoulders as she crouched on the bank. But listen long enough and she will tell you her plans. So when the district authority came to Berhanpur with a ribbon of promises and a white truck of engineers, the town leaned forward like a family at a wedding. A weir, a slotted, concrete span meant to steady the river's temperament and feed a gleaming new turbine, would be built at the old mill's bend. They said it would light the town, spin mills, and make water flow in measured generosity. 10 engineers arrived from the provincial capital, each with a different set of metal-rimmed glasses and a bag of bearings. Photographs of the finished project hung on the office wall like prayer cards, turbines humming, children with electric fans, a husband smiling in his refrigerator-lit kitchen. The engineers took measurements, argued about load factors, and spoke words like shear stress and coffer dam, with the calm of people reading the weather in a book rather than by watching clouds. For 2 months the construction ate at the river like a patient consuming a long, seated plan. Concrete rose where reeds had been. The old wooden bridge sagged with the weight of machines. Mariam watched from her stall, fingers worrying a hem, listening to men in helmets talk around cups of tea she supplied gratis. There was, she realized, an arrogance to the noise. They had a plan, and the river would have to cooperate. The day the turbines started, the town clapped in their small, exhausted way. Lights blinked across the main street like a constellation rearranged. The market ran on new hours. Young boys charged their phones at the electrician's garage and came out shining with a light they had never known. For a week everything seemed to have been written into a tidy ledger, until the river began to cough. It began with a smell, and smell was the kind of thing Mariam trusted from her bones. The water at the weir's base carried a soreness, a rusty sour, like a tin left in rain. Fish bobbed at odd angles near the surface, The reeds where the children played rippled with a sluggishness that should not have belonged to a river in the heart of summer. Farmers brought their jars to the tap at the new waterworks and came away with mud that would not settle. The engineers convened under an awning of corporate banners. They walked the length of the concrete with clipboards and earnest brows, peering through calloused fingers like men reading an unwilling scripture. They announced it was a design miscalculation, a flow pattern that had not been predicted, microscopic fissures where the pressure met the stone, fluctuations in sediment deposition. They organized meetings in the municipal hall and presented slides with graphs and a hypothesis that involved calculations no one in Baronpur could follow. They promised repairs and told the town to remain calm. Their confidence lay like a warm cloth over the problem. But the cloth was thin. Days grew into weeks. Pumps were brought from the city. Strainers were fitted. The men replaced bolts and tweaked turbine blades in a ritual that felt half faith, half surgery. The engineers ran tests all morning and sipped tea all afternoon. In the evenings they wrote reports with the solemnity of monks. But the smell persisted, and the river lost the quicksilver flicker of its old current. Crops along the downstream banks began to yellow. Children who had been playing gaily at the water's edge came home with stomachaches. Money began to walk in anxious circles around the town. I told them, murmured old Hamid, the miller, to anyone who would listen. Hamid liked to talk about his father's reed basket, about how the river had been a friend when men had not. You can't put concrete across a woman like her and expect no quarrel. Miriam felt the quarrel like an old bruise. She did not know the names on the glossy reports, but she knew the river's complaints. She spent mornings at her stall and afternoons crouched on the low bank where the concrete met the old streambed. She watched the water hit the stone and slide into the slots of the weir and thought about how water had once tucked itself into the mill's wooden flume with a patient, coil-like motion. She saw eddies form in places the engineers had wrapped into their slide decks as expected flow patterns. She saw the gravel that had built up, grain by grain, like a memory forgetting its place. One afternoon, when the heat pushed the town into a lethargic shimmer, she heard the slap of boots on the concrete and looked up. Engineer Malik, a young man with a permanent crease of worry between his brows, was leaning over the slot, peering into the murk. Beside him, two technicians argued over a tablet. Sediment load has doubled, Malik said when he noticed her watching, as if the river had granted her permission to listen. These were projections for a different basin. The upstream catchment changed. Illegal logging, probably. We need dredging and a new sluice mechanism. The cost. Can't you just open the gate? Miriam said. Her voice was small but not surprised. She had been born with a tone that made questions seem like stones you could set in place. Malik looked at her the way people look at a child who has whispered the names of stars. The gates are automated. A manual intervention now might unbalance the control system. He smiled, a quick wave of professional indulgence. We have to follow protocol. And the river, she asked. He hesitated. We're designing a dynamic control to account for sediment flux. Designs take time, Miriam said. Across the river, a heron tilted its head and watched. What if that takes the town with it? Malik's smile thinned. He walked away with the tablet tucked under his arm, and the men returned to their calculations. That night, Miriam dreamed of her grandfather standing ankle deep in the river, finger tracing the belly of a current like a seam that needed mending. She woke with the taste of iron on her tongue and dressed in the old overalls she kept for mending motorbikes and her own heart. She went to the store, bought a coil of rope and a length of canvas, and, because small things had always made the difference in her life, she took a pack of cumin seeds. her grandfather's talisman against stubbornness, and tucked them into her pocket. At dawn, she walked to the weir. The engineers' lights still blinked from their temporary office. A security guard nodded at her because she knew his daughter, then returned to his thermos. The river, for a moment, looked like a sleeping animal, its breath condensed in the low fog. Miriam crouched at the lip where the water went into the turbine slots and let her hands go into the flow. The water tugged around her wrists, cool and insistent. She felt the pressure change as it passed each slot, a whispered language. At the third slot from the right, something clung. A braided rope of grass and plastic, a noodle-shaped mat of sediment. Her fingers found it and pulled. The rope came free with a reluctant pop and a slap of silt. She thought of the old mill flume where, once upon a time, a wooden screen had been lashed across to hold back the big logs and let the water slide clear. She thought of how her grandfather had taken a reed and wove it into a trap for eels so they would not damage the wheel. None of this fit any schematic the engineers had discussed. It was, as Malik had said, manual. It would be clumsy, imperfect. It would be human. Miriam tied the canvas to the coil of rope and fashioned a crude apron she could lower into the slot like a tongue. The idea was not to dam the river. She had no illusions of stopping this much water, but to make a lip that would catch the silt and channel them into a slow pool where someone could scoop them away. It was a stitch, a seam between button and hole. She lowered the apron at the third slot, wrapped the rope around a bollard, and dug her heels into the slick concrete. The current tugged, her fingernails filled with mud. It was harder than she imagined, a fight of patience and wet. The canvas took on the water and ballooned like a stubborn bladder, but its lip did what she hoped. It bloomed a pocket, and the mat of sediment snagged on its edge. She whistled softly, the way her grandfather had whistled when a task was going to work. A hand clamped on her shoulder before she could finish. Malik's face hovered over hers, eyes flicking between the canvas and the river, then to the rope wound around her arm. "You can't," he began. She turned, not surprised. "It's only a temporary screen. It's untested. You could unbalance the back pressure, the control system." "You have your codes?" she said. "I have my hands. If you want to test, then test your models. But not while the children are drinking the river's cough." He looked at her, as if considering the geometry of a puzzle. Around them, a few technicians had gathered like a small, improvised jury. The convenience of authority makes people eager to believe in the spill of numbers rather than in a woman's patience. Malik's jaw worked. "If this works, we'll document it. We'll run simulations." "If it works," she said, tightening the rope, "help me scoop the mat out." Something shifted in Malik then, a small, professional humility that some people carry only when the pragmatic becomes unavoidable. He rolled up his sleeves. The men in the crowd grumbled. This was not in their schedule, but they waded in, two at a time, and scooped with nets and hands and the flat of shovel blades. Water slushed around their knees. It was hard work, messy as a kitchen floor. For the first time since the turbines had started, the water's surface took on a quickness, a reflected light that made the concrete look less like a coffin and more like a tool. They did not fix everything that day. The engineers would later call Miriam's apron a stop-gap mitigation. In their reports, filling their pages with a phrase like an offering, they wrote it as if the cloth were an appendix to the true story of expertise. But the children's stomachs eased, and the fish moved from the top of the water to the middle with a shiver of relief. The town slept more easily. News, which begins as gossip and loves nothing better than a name with an edge, found Miriam. Someone filmed her lowering the canvas with a phone, and the clip moved like a small flame across social threads. A local reporter called her the seamstress who saved the river. and for a week she found herself the center of small, incredulous attention. The engineers were polite in the papers, stating the technical reasons for the failure and noting the temporary interventions. The district office praised the rapid response of their team and promised an independent review. Malik gave interviews about modeling improvements. Miriam, though, did not want interviews. She kept repairing sleeves and making tea. She felt a strange pressure, like someone had placed a bright stone on her chest. People now watched her with an admiration that sometimes tasted of ownership. Men from the city came with smiles that smelled of opportunity. A young woman working for an NGO asked if Miriam would lead training workshops to teach others. Indigenous technical solutions. The Freeds bid Miriam wince. Indigenous sounded like an exhibit label. But she agreed to 2 workshops because she liked the look on the students' faces when they built something that worked. Then the sound shifted, like a bruise being tested for tenderness. The company that had financed the weir, the same company with glossy brochures and a logo that looked like a blue comma, began to make noises that felt different than gratitude. A corporate lawyer arrived in Baranpur with thick briefs and a smile that did not move his eyes. He congratulated the engineers and then turned his attention to Miriam. "You are very clever," he said in a voice bred for negotiation. "Perhaps we can employ you as a consultant. We could offer a stipend, some training." Miriam thought of her tea stall, the kettle, the fold of old linen she folded each morning. She thought of the rope in her hands and the way the river listened to pressure more than to plans. "I do not want to be an ornament," she said. "Not an ornament," the lawyer repeated as if tasting a new spice. "No. We would formalize your role. There is a possibility of patenting certain mitigations, of commercializing community-based silt traps for use in other sites." "You want to patent what I tied to the bollard," Miriam said. The idea of someone selling the way her fingers worked made a small, hot fist in her stomach. "We would patent the mechanism," he said. "You would be the face of the campaign." She thought of bartering her tea for a boy's broken bicycle, of sewing a hem while listening to the river. Her fingers tightened. "No." The lawyer shrugged with the lightness of a man who measures ethics by how far his contracts can stretch. He left the town and, within days, a glossy circular arrived in Malik's office. The language was careful. The company would fund additional research in exchange for licensing rights to innovations developed during the project. Malik was torn. He had a map of his career in his head. Promotions, a doctoral program, patents under his belt. And the circular offered him a line on that map. The engineers argued in the municipal hall. Some said the company's terms were exploitative and would commodify a communal fix. Others said the funding would go to more robust modeling and save lives in other towns. The issue cleaved the project community like a sudden monsoon. Citizens' groups held meetings. Some argued Miriam had performed an extraordinary civic service and idealized the idea that the solution was communal property. Others whispered that the company could bring the region jobs, scholarships for the best students, infrastructure. Greed and pride, dressed in different uniforms, began to speak. Miriam watched the courtroom of public opinion without words. She lived by small economies, how much salt in a pot, the trade for a bag of nails. She thought of the lawyer's polished hands and of Malik's wary honesty in the early days, when he had helped pull silt with his own hands. She could have signed the papers and learned the language of patents, and patents would have treated her like a small island. She could have taken the stipend and moved to the city and bought an electric kettle and a pair of shoes with laces that did not fray. But there is a kind of knowledge that once monetized changes its weight. Her cloth would become a commodity, the rope in her pocket, a product line. At the next public meeting, a crowd gathered with banners made from bed sheets. The company sent a representative and Malik attended, pulled between loyalty to his employer and to the town that had raised him. Huh? The lawyer arrived with a folder the thickness of a brick. Miriam came without notes. She stood near the edge and listened. People rose and spoke with other people's courage. Hamid, the miller, told a parable about a man who tried to fence a river and learned that the river always remembers the places where men have been unkind. A farmer spoke about seeds that had failed after the water choked. Children held drawings of rivers where fish wore necklaces of garbage and rainbows were tangled in weeds. When the company representative took the floor, he spoke of scalability, of how the design could be sold across the province, how the town could profit through royalties. Miriam's turn arrived like a quiet tide. She walked to the front and looked at the faces arranged in rows, some hopeful, some hungry, some calculating. Her hands were clean, the marks of river gone into the memory of her palms. She sat on the stage and took off her shoes and spoke without slides. "This river feeds us," she said. "She doesn't ask for patents. When she is sick, children are sick. When she is healthy, everyone eats. I tied a cloth to a bollard because the river would not wait for a committee to write minutes. I do not want to be a slogan or a product or a brand. I want people to know how to mend what is broken without selling it back to someone at a price." Her words went out into the crowd like the exact note of a bell. For some people it rang true. For others it made their teeth ache. The company's lawyer prepared to speak, to reframe her refusal as parochialism, as sentimentalism that could be tempered by development. Malik, who sat near the back, felt his loyalties like a tug of war rope across his chest. He had seen how practical solutions could be polished into innovation with the right engineering. He had also seen, with a clarity that terrified him, the town's dependence on models that did not know the names of the reeds. In the end, the resolution was messy and unsatisfying in the way of real decisions. The company withdrew the broadest claims to intellectual property in the face of public outcry and agreed instead to fund a local cooperative that would maintain the weir and share its revenue for river stewardship. Malik negotiated for research funds that would remain under municipal oversight rather than corporate control. Miriam refused any official title. In private, she accepted a small, anonymous envelope from the cooperative that paid for a new sewing machine for her sister and a proper roof slab for Hamid's mill. The town agreed to manage the weir with technical support from the engineers, and the company, shorn of its expansionist dreams, kept a minor contract to supply replacement parts. In the liminal weeks after the agreement, something larger changed under the surface. People began to cross from the world of pamphlets and projections to the world of shared labor. Children were taught how to make a canvas apron and how to net silk properly. Malik led weekend classes for teenage boys and girls, not with the arrogance of a teacher, but with the curiosity of a student learning to listen. He showed them how to read stress patterns on concrete, how to judge sediment flux by the way the sunlight slanted across the water's skin. He told them stories about when he had been wrong and what he learned from being wet and tired on the weir's lip. There were other changes too, less tidy, harder to fit into minutes of meetings. The cooperative needed governance, and governance required compromises. Not all of them were noble. There were accusations, small steals of fund allocations, a secretary who took a little more than was hers. People argued about whether to plant mangroves downstream or invest in an irrigation pump. Greed persists like a weed, and even in a town that had learned from a cloth and a rope, it found places to sprout. Miriam watched most of this with the same equanimity she brought to mending hems. She accepted the newness of attention and the difficulty of change. Sometimes she would walk alone along the river at dusk, smelling cumin and wet stone, and think of the engineer's tablet and the lawyer's folder. She had saved the town, but she had not saved it from its own hunger. That, she knew, was the long work of living together. The moment that made the county councilman come up the lane in mustard suits was an afternoon in late monsoon when the river, swollen with rain from the hills, tried to test the weir as a lion tests a door. The sluice gates, which had been redesigned with Malik's oversight and the cooperative's scrutiny, clanged and groaned. The sensors flashed an angry red on the monitoring station. Teams rushed. Miriam stood with a bucket and two young apprentices, knees deep in a current that smelled of earth and rain. They worked like people who had practiced on small failures and returned with better hands. When the worst passed and water settled into a roar that meant survival rather than panic, the district official sent Malik a telegram praising the resilience of the installation. The company wrote an article about community, integrated engineering, and quoted Malik, who had learned the delicate competence of not letting praise outweigh responsibility. The governor cut the ribbon for the new maintenance shed, and journalists asked Miriam to stand beside Malik while photographs captured their close, the engineer and the woman who had, in the neatness of a single act, rearranged how expertise looked. She allowed them one photograph. In the image she stood barefoot, sleeves rolled, the folds of her dress still carrying the faint pattern of river silt. Malik stood in his spotless polo, a faint smile on his mouth that indicated someone who had learned the consequences of arrogance. The camera framed them as a tableau of reconciliation. The world liked neatness and images that told uncomplicated stories, but the photograph could not capture the small memories Malik's hands in the mud the day he first helped. The way he sat up at night, sketching streamlines with a pencil rather than a tablet, or how Hamid washed his hands in the river after a cooperative meeting and then hummed a song from his father's time. It could not capture the way Miriam sometimes woke at night to the sound of someone crying for a child's fever, or the way she later, on a market day, slipped an extra sugar cube into a woman's tea because the woman's pockets had been lighter than usual. The world, in the end, was made of these small, grainy acts. The engineers had not been useless. Without them, the weir might have collapsed into a concrete ruin. The company had not been pure. Their greed had almost turned ingenuity into a commodity. Miriam, too, was not a saint. She was a woman who had tied a cloth and who preferred the river to have a name rather than to be the subject of a quarterly profit report. She had been brave, stubborn, and stubborn again when people wanted to buy her quiet. People liked a story with a single hero. Berhampur's story resisted that neatness. It wanted a chorus. Children learned to make little aprons for the sluice slots. Malik's children played with ropes. The cooperative hired two women from a neighboring village to teach sewing and river care. The company returned in a smaller, chastened shape, contributing funds for a proper fish ladder to help spawning during monsoons. The changes were incremental and often ugly, full of negotiations and grudges and the occasional theft. But the river stopped coughing. Years later, when a journalist came and asked Miriam whether she had ever imagined herself in the photograph with Malik, she smiled and said, "I did not imagine much. I mended. I listened." The journalist tried to wrap the answer into a paragraph that would travel well on the morning feed. From seamstress to savant, whom outfoxed 10 engineers. Miriam laughed softly. Titles were thin, like bed sheets, good for covering things but not for holding them. What happened next? The journalist coaxed, searching for a neat line. What happened next? Miriam repeated, looking at the river that had taken their stones and returned coolness. We'll learn how to keep each other wet with work. We argue. We make ugly decisions, and sometimes good ones. The engineers learned to have their feet in the water, sometimes. The company learned not to buy everything with a smile. I learned that a river is a long conversation. She sipped her tea, now lukewarm. The kettle's whistle a memory she carried in her bones. The story of Baron Purr became a footnote in an engineering journal, a case study in community resilience. It became a viral article about a woman outwitting technology. It became a cautionary tale for men in suits. But for the people who had stood in the mud and scooped with muddy hands, the story was less tidy. It was a list of nights and stitches, of small decisions and larger protests, of a woman who had tied a cloth to a bollard with a rope and set a town into a noise that could not be stitched up by proprietary language. On a bright morning, years after Malik had gone to the capital to accept a grant for a research fellowship and later returned with a salt and pepper beer to the sense that numbers could be companions rather than gods, Miriam walked the length of the weir with an apprentice. She showed the child how to tie the canvas to a bollard and how to feel the river's temperature by pressing the inside of their wrists to the current. The child listened as if to a bedtime story, eyes wide, learning the grammar of water. When they reached the third slot, Miriam paused and tucked a fresh pack of cumin seeds into the child's pocket. "For stubbornness," she said. The child laughed, and the river laughed back, a long, indifferent, generous sound. In the photograph that hung in the town hall, faded now at the edges, the woman and the engineer smiled at one another like people learned to forgive a world that loved its equations and its small, unpatented stitches equally. The town fed itself. The river kept its conversation, sometimes loud, sometimes low, always patient. And sometimes, when the children ran in the dusk and the lamps turned on like small moons, someone would lean toward Miriam and whisper, "You did what 10 engineers couldn't." She would smile, and her answer was always the same. "They did their part. I did mine." We listened,